Hello, class. This will be the last recording for chapter 3. We're going to talk about the following here. So the first thing we're going to talk about is this idea of what's called a 5-number summary of data. And so basically the 5 numbers are quite useful. The minimum, maximum, and then the 3 quartiles, the first, the second, which is the median, and the third. And it gives you quite a bit of information when doing this calculation. And what I will show you how to do is use spreadsheet calculations to help you with this. So what I did is I took this set of data for absences in a school in Montana for the month of January. And so what I did is I typed the data in right here. And so once the data is in, first thing you want to do is sort it. So you highlight and you go to data, you hit sort, and you can see I always 99% of the time smallest to largest, so that's the default. And you can see I've sorted it from smallest to largest. So to do this 5 calculations here, the minimum is pretty obvious. That's 41, right? Maximum should be pretty obvious. That's 100. But even if you don't sort it, you would get, if you use the functionality of this function called quartile, here it is, quartile, you get all 5 of those numbers. So let me show you how to do the minimum, for example. You highlight the data set, and if you type in the 0 for the second one, and you'd see there's it might be a little bit small on the screen there, but you could see that if you type in a 0, you would get the minimum, which is 41. You could do the same with the maximum. But the ones that are a lot harder to calculate, which is nice to use the functionality, is the quartiles. So again, you highlight the data set, type in 1 for quartile number 1, and we get the number 45. So you can see it's this data set right there. Median would be typing in 2. So let me pull that one up. And now 2 would be median or quartile number 2. I think that should be 51. Yep. And then quartile number 3, you would type in 3 for that number after you highlight the data. So first one's highlight the data. Second one would be quartile number 3. And you could see that you get 59. So your calculator has a functionality, as you can see here, this TI-84. This is from the book. We'll walk through those calculations for you as well. Using the spreadsheet with the ALEKS homework, I find much easier because a lot of this data I will download directly instead of trying to type all this in a calculator, which becomes very tedious. So what's a little bit different is this book does this box plot where they want to get rid of the outliers. I've taught stats class where other box plots include the outliers. So obviously, I'm going to go through what this book is asking. So when you generate this box plot, the first thing that you want to do is you want to have a scale. And so you can see in step 2 there, they did a nice scale. And so if we were doing it by hand, which this one is kind of hard to do. I don't have a good way to do it on an Excel spreadsheet. So I find that once I have the data, it's not too bad just to do this by hand. And so this would be 80, this would be 90, and this would be 100. So when you generate the box, the middle of the box is the median. So the middle of the box here would be 51, right? And the lower end of the box would be the first quartile. So this would be 45. This would be 51. And the upper end of the box would be the second quartile, and that would be 59. So that would be right before 60. So that would be 59. So the question is now, what do we do next? Well, what do we do next in generating the box plot? And the way that this book describes it is step 3 is you calculate the two boundaries. In the book that I've taught out of, you just put the maximum and minimum and away you go. So this one's a little bit more complicated, but this would be a good review of these two boundaries, right? So the first thing we need to calculate is the IQR, right? And remember that is Q3 minus Q1. And so when you do that calculation, you would get Q3 minus Q1, and we get the number 14. So the next thing we want to do is we want to multiply it by 1.5, right? Here's multiply. And I like to label everything just because if I ever go back, it's nice to know what I did, right? Times 1.5. And now that would be 21. And so if we go back to our calculation, that is the IQR times 1.5. So now we're going to take each one of these boundaries and do the subtraction and addition like we did to find the outliers. And so when we do that calculation, the lower bound, as I called it in the previous presentation, would be Q1 minus the LRQ. Start over there, that didn't work out right. So the lower bound is Q1 minus 21. There we go. So the lower bound is 24. The upper bound is Q3 plus now the IRQ times 1.5. And you can see the upper bound is 80. So when we go back to the presentation, you can see these are the two upper bounds. And so the way that this book likes to illustrate it is that you don't want any data on this chart bigger than the upper bound or lower than the lower bound. So what you do is you go back to the data and say, okay, the lower bound is 24. Do I have any numbers lower than 24? And the answer is no. So here's where you use the minimum. And so if you went back to our box here on our whiteboard, our minimum is 41, all right? So we would take and go all the way down here, and that would be number 41. And I like to label them on the top so I know what all the numbers are. So I would recommend doing that. And then the second thing is our lower bound. And if we go back to our lower bound, which is the number 80. So we can't use any numbers greater than 80. So 100 is what's considered an outlier. So this book likes us to leave that out of the plot. And so the end of the high end is going to be 77. So when we go back here on the whiteboard, we would go all the way to say here, and that would be 77. So that's how you generate these 5 numbers and then the box plot. I never found a really easy way to do it on an Excel spreadsheet. There's a complicated way of doing it, which I'm not going to go through. And so you could see here that if you walk through the example in the book, you could see that step 6, it basically says remove the 100 because it's an outlier. And so we go all the way up to 77. So you'll see in the book, It seems like the fancy calculators have a box plot built in, the way that the book is describing. So feel free to look at that, but you can't download the calculator when you do homework, especially when you do a quiz or exam, if this is on one of that. So I would practice a couple of these by hand. You'll see that when you do it in Alex, they'll have a place where you generate the box and do it that way. So that actually ends the recorded lectures for chapter 3.